The rain hammered against the glass facade of Sterling Financial Group's headquarters as I stood in the lobby, shaking droplets from my navy blazer. 23 floors of gleaming steel and ambition stretched above me, and somewhere in this maze of corporate hierarchy, I had a job to do. A very important job that nobody was expecting. My name is Margot, and I'm a senior auditor for the State Financial Regulatory Commission. At 28, I've built a reputation for being thorough, fair, and unfortunately, for some companies, incredibly good at finding what they'd rather keep hidden. Sterling Financial had been on our radar for months due to some irregularities in their quarterly reports, and today was the day I'd been assigned to conduct a surprise audit. The thing about surprise audits is that they're meant to catch companies off guard, to see how they operate when they're not putting on a show. What I hadn't counted on was being caught off guard myself. As I approached the reception desk, a harried-looking woman with perfectly styled blonde hair barely glanced up from her computer screen. Her nameplate read, Jessica, Executive Assistant. "Excuse me," I began, pulling out my credentials. "I'm Margot Chen from the State Financial—" "Oh, thank God," Jessica interrupted, practically leaping from her chair. "You're here! I was starting to panic." The meeting starts in 10 minutes, and we're completely understaffed today. Sarah called in sick, and Michelle is at her kid's school play. I blinked, confused. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm not—" "No time for modesty," Jessica rushed on, grabbing a black apron from behind the desk and thrusting it into my hands. "You're the temp from Elite Catering Services, right? Please tell me you know how to work the espresso machine. Mr. Whitmore is very particular about his coffee." Before I could protest, she was already leading me toward the elevators, her heels clicking rapidly against the marble floor. The elevator doors closed before I could fully process what was happening. "The executive conference room is on the 19th floor," Jessica continued breathlessly as we ascended. "There's a full catering setup already there. Just need someone to serve the refreshments and keep the coffee flowing. The board meeting should run about 2 hours, maybe 3 if they get into the quarterly projections." The elevator dinged, and the doors opened to reveal a sleek corridor lined with oil paintings and floor-to-ceiling windows. Jessica practically pushed me out, pointing toward a set of double doors at the end of the hall. "Everything you need is in there. And remember, they like their coffee strong. And Mr. Whitmore takes his with 2 sugars and a splash of cream. Don't let him intimidate you. He's actually quite nice once you get to know him." And just like that, she was gone, leaving me standing in the hallway with a catering apron in my hands and a growing sense of disbelief. This was definitely not how I'd planned to start my audit. I looked down at my professional attire, a crisp white blouse, navy blazer, and matching pencil skirt. Not exactly catering wear, but I'd been mistaken for worse things. The smart thing would be to march right back to that elevator, find Jessica, and straighten out this confusion immediately. But as I stood there, I could hear voices coming from the conference room. Male voices, discussing numbers and projections with the kind of casual confidence that suggested they believed they were completely alone and unobserved. The auditor in me perked up with interest. Sometimes the best intelligence comes from the most unexpected places. I slipped on the apron and pushed through the conference room doors. The room was impressive. A long mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs, with a panoramic view of the city skyline. A catering station had been set up along one wall, complete with an industrial-grade espresso machine, various pastries, and what looked like enough coffee to fuel a small army. 6 men in expensive suits were already seated around the table, deep in conversation. They barely glanced up as I entered, which was exactly what I was hoping for. "Gentlemen," I said softly, moving toward the coffee station, "I'll be taking care of your refreshments today. Please let me know if you need anything." A few mumbled acknowledgments, but their attention quickly returned to their discussion. I busied myself with the espresso machine, listening carefully as I prepared their drinks. "The Seattle branch numbers are still off," one of them was saying, a heavy-set man with silver hair who I assumed was Mr. Whitmore. "Revenue's up 12%, but the expense ratios don't match what we reported last quarter." "We can massage those figures," another voice replied smoothly. "Same way we handled the Portland situation. A few strategic reclassifications and everything balances out." I nearly dropped the coffee cup I was holding. "Strategic reclassifications?" That was accounting speak for moving money around to hide problems, and it was exactly the kind of thing that had triggered our investigation in the first place. "Coffee?" I asked brightly, approaching the table with a tray of steaming cups. "About time," grumbled a younger man in a pinstripe suit. "I specifically requested the meeting start at 9:30 so we'd have time for proper refreshments." I served each man his coffee with a smile, noting their names as they were mentioned in conversation. Whitmore was clearly the CEO, and the smooth-talking one was someone called Davidson, probably the CFO based on his intimate knowledge of the company's financial maneuvering. "The auditors are supposed to arrive sometime this week," Whitmore was saying as I arranged pastries on individual plates. "State Commission's sending someone to look at our books." "Which books?" Davidson asked with a chuckle that made my skin crawl. "The clean ones, obviously. Everything else is safely tucked away in our secondary system. Besides, these government auditors are usually fresh out of college with no real-world experience. Show them a few legitimate transactions, give them the standard tour, and they'll be gone by Friday." The other men around the table laughed, and I felt my jaw tighten. Fresh out of college? No real-world experience? I'd been doing this job for 6 years and had exposed more corporate fraud than most seasoned investigators saw in a decade. "More coffee, gentlemen?" I asked, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. "Yes, and make it stronger this time," snapped the man in pinstripes. "This tastes like dishwater." I smiled sweetly and returned to the coffee station, my mind racing. In less than 30 minutes, I'd already heard enough to justify a full-scale investigation. But they were just getting started, and I had a feeling this was going to be even more interesting than I'd initially thought. As I prepared fresh coffee, I caught sight of my reflection in the polished surface of the espresso machine. Hair slightly mussed from the rain, wearing a catering apron over my business suit, serving coffee to men who were casually discussing financial fraud while dismissing auditors as incompetent college graduates. If they only knew that the auditor they were so confident they could fool was standing right there, listening to every word they said. The irony was almost delicious enough to make me forget how insulting their comments were. Almost. The next hour was both the most frustrating and most enlightening of my career. I moved around that conference room like a ghost, refilling coffee cups, replacing empty pastry plates, and absorbing every word of what was essentially a master class in corporate fraud. "The real beauty of our system," Davidson was explaining to a newcomer who'd arrived late, a nervous-looking man introduced as Peterson from the legal department, "is that we maintain 2 completely separate sets of books. The official records show everything by the book, while our internal tracking system reflects the actual movement of funds." Peterson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "But what if the auditors dig deeper? What if they start asking for source documents?" "They won't," Whitmore assured him, cutting into a Danish with surgical precision. "I've been dealing with these regulatory inspections for 15 years. They follow the same playbook every time. Request the standard reports, interview a few key personnel, maybe spot-check a handful of transactions. As long as we give them what they expect to see, they'll rubber stamp their approval and move on." I was standing directly behind Whitmore as he spoke, pouring his 3rd cup of coffee. The urge to dump the entire pot over his smug head was almost overwhelming, but I forced myself to remain professional. This was better than any undercover operation I could have planned. "What about the Vancouver account?" asked a younger executive I hadn't heard speak before. "The one with the quarterly transfers?" The room suddenly went quiet, and I felt the tension spike. I continued arranging sugar packets, trying to appear completely absorbed in my task. "We don't discuss Vancouver in mixed company," Davidson said carefully, his eyes flicking toward me. For a moment, I thought they'd figured out who I was. My heart hammered against my ribs as I waited for someone to demand to see my credentials or ask why a caterer was so interested in their conversation. Instead, Whitmore waved dismissively. "She's just the help. Probably doesn't even speak English as a first language." The casual racism hit me like a physical blow. I kept my expression neutral, but inside I was seething. These men didn't just think they were above the law. They thought they were above basic human decency. "The Vancouver transfers are clean," Davidson continued, apparently satisfied that I posed no threat. "We've structured them as consulting fees paid to our subsidiary. Technically legitimate, practically invisible. And the timeline? Peterson pressed. Monthly transfers always on the 15th. Been running for 18 months now. Total movement is approaching 8 figures. I nearly choked on my own saliva. 8 figures? We were talking about tens of millions of dollars being moved through what sounded like a shell company. This wasn't just creative accounting. This was large-scale money laundering. More coffee? I asked, proud of how steady my voice sounded. God, yes, muttered the youngest executive. And see if you can find some real cream. This powdered stuff is awful. I nodded and headed back to the catering station, my mind spinning. In 2 hours, I'd gathered enough evidence to launch a federal investigation. The challenge now was figuring out how to proceed without blowing my cover. My phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at it quickly. It was from my supervisor at the commission. Margot, heard you were delayed getting into Sterling Financial. Security says you never checked in. Everything okay? I typed back quickly. Small delay. Conducting preliminary observation. Will report in soon. Preliminary observation was code for exactly what I was doing, gathering intelligence before announcing my presence. My supervisor would understand. Are you texting on company time? I looked up to find Davidson standing right next to me, his expression suspicious. Up close, he was even more unsettling. Sharp features, cold eyes, and the kind of smile that never reached beyond his mouth. I'm sorry, sir, I said, slipping my phone back into my pocket. My agency was just checking to make sure I arrived safely. Your agency? His tone was dangerously quiet. Elite Catering Services, I replied smoothly. They like to keep track of their employees when we're working off-site. Davidson stared at me for a long moment, and I could practically see the gears turning in his head. Then, apparently satisfied, he returned to his seat. Where's that cream? Called out the youngest executive. I'll check the kitchen, I said, grateful for an excuse to leave the room. I stepped into the hallway and immediately pulled out my phone. I needed to contact my team and get back up here as soon as possible. But as I started to dial, I heard footsteps behind me. Find everything you need? I turned to see Jessica approaching, her expression friendly but curious. Actually, I said, thinking quickly, I wanted to let you know that I might need to extend my assignment here. The meeting seems to be running longer than expected. Oh, that's fine, Jessica said. Elite Catering called earlier to confirm your booking. They mentioned you were one of their most experienced servers. My blood ran cold. If Elite Catering had called to confirm a booking, that meant they actually had sent someone. Someone who was probably standing in the lobby right now, wondering why their assignment had been given to someone else. Excuse me, I said, trying to keep my voice casual. I need to use the restroom. I walked quickly toward the elevator, my mind racing. I needed to get to the lobby and intercept the real caterer before they came upstairs and exposed my charade. But as the elevator doors opened, I found myself face to face with a young woman in a black uniform carrying a box of catering supplies. Excuse me, she said, looking confused. I'm looking for the Sterling Financial Executive Conference Room. I'm supposed to be catering a board meeting, but the front desk said someone was already handling it. This was it. Game over. I think there might have been a mix-up, I started to say, but then I heard the elevator behind me ding. Margot? I turned to see Jessica stepping out of the other elevator, her expression now decidedly less friendly. I just got off the phone with Elite Catering Services, she said slowly. They said their employee for today's meeting is named Rebecca, and she's a 22-year-old brunette. Jessica's eyes moved between me and the young woman with the catering supplies. So I have to ask, who exactly are you? The real Rebecca looked back and forth between us, clearly confused. Jessica was staring at me with growing suspicion. And somewhere behind us, 6 executives were casually discussing financial crimes worth millions of dollars. I took a deep breath and made a decision that would either make my career or end it. My name is Margot Chen, I said, reaching into my blazer and pulling out my credentials. I'm a senior auditor with the State Financial Regulatory Commission, and I'm here to conduct a surprise audit of Sterling Financial Group. Jessica's face went white. Rebecca dropped her box of supplies. And from the conference room behind us, I could hear the sound of men laughing about something they found particularly amusing. They had no idea their world was about to change forever. The silence in the hallway stretched like a taut wire. Jessica stared at my credentials as if they were written in a foreign language, while Rebecca stood frozen with her mouth slightly open. I could feel my heart pounding, but there was also a strange sense of relief. The charade was over. You're a government auditor?" Jessica whispered. "Senior auditor," I corrected, tucking my credentials back into my blazer. "And I've been listening to your executives discuss financial irregularities for the past 2 hours." Jessica's face cycled through several emotions: confusion, fear, and then something that looked almost like admiration. "You mean you've been undercover this whole time?" "Not intentionally," I admitted. "But when you handed me that apron and assumed I was the caterer, I decided to see what I could learn." "I'm so sorry," Rebecca interjected, still looking bewildered. "I can just leave if you want. I mean, I don't want to interfere with government business or anything." "Actually," I said, an idea forming, "I might need your help, both of you." I quickly explained the situation, how I'd been mistaken for the caterer, what I'd overheard, and why it was crucial that the executives inside didn't realize their conversation had been compromised. "You want me to pretend you're still the caterer?" Jessica asked, her voice rising slightly. "Just for a little while longer. I need to document what I've heard and get my team here to secure the evidence. If they realize I'm an auditor now, they'll have time to destroy documents and coordinate their stories." Jessica looked back toward the conference room, then at me. "What they're doing? It's really illegal?" "Very illegal. We're talking about potential fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. This could be a federal case." "Good," Jessica said firmly. "Mr. Whitmore cut my department's budget last quarter and laid off 3 people, including my friend Sarah. If he's been stealing money, I want him caught." Rebecca nodded eagerly. "And I could use the story. I'm actually a journalism student. I only do catering to pay for school. This could be my big break." "Absolutely not," I said quickly. "This is an ongoing investigation. Nothing gets published until the case is closed, and even then, only with official approval." Rebecca looked disappointed but nodded. "Okay, but can I at least help? I promise I won't write anything without permission." I looked at both women, Jessica, who clearly had her own grievances with the company, and Rebecca, who seemed genuinely eager to help. It was highly irregular, but then again, this entire situation had been irregular from the start. "Here's what we're going to do," I said. "Rebecca, you take over the catering duties. Jessica, you're going to help me access the company's financial records. I need to see those secondary books they mentioned." "I don't have access to high-level financial data," Jessica said. "But you have access to the executive offices, right? Including Davidson's?" Jessica nodded slowly. "I have master keys for the executive floor, but if we get caught, we won't get caught if we're smart about it. How long do these board meetings usually run?" "Another hour, maybe 2. They always take a break around 11 for more coffee and pastries." I checked my watch. It was 10:45. "Perfect. Rebecca, when they take their break, keep them occupied. Ask about dietary restrictions, offer to prepare fresh items, anything to keep them in that conference room. Jessica and I will use that time to gather evidence." "What if they ask questions about the catering change?" Rebecca asked. "Tell them there was a scheduling mix-up, but everything's been sorted out. Most executives don't pay attention to service staff anyway. They'll probably barely notice." It was a harsh truth, but one I'd learned over the years. People in power often overlooked the people who served them, which was exactly what I was counting on. "What about you?" Jessica asked. "If you're not the caterer anymore, what's your cover story?" I thought about it for a moment. "I'm Rebecca's supervisor. Elite Catering sent me to make sure everything was running smoothly for such an important client." "That could work," Jessica said. "You definitely look more managerial than Rebecca." "Hey!" Rebecca protested. "It's not an insult," I assured her. "It's actually perfect. You look young and harmless, which means they'll underestimate you. That's exactly what we want." We worked out the details quickly. Rebecca would take over the catering duties while I observed from the background, taking notes and looking official. When the executives took their break, Jessica would escort me to Davidson's office while Rebecca kept them occupied. "One more thing," I said, as we prepared to put our plan into action. If anyone asks direct questions about who I am, stick to the cover story. I'm a catering supervisor, nothing more. What if they recognize you later? Jessica asked. When you come back as an auditor? I smiled grimly. Trust me, they won't. People see what they expect to see, and they're expecting a meek government bureaucrat, not someone who's been serving them coffee. We returned to the conference room, where the executives were still deep in their discussion. I was pleased to see that my absence hadn't been noticed. They were too absorbed in their criminal conspiracy to pay attention to the help. Gentlemen, Rebecca announced brightly, I'm Rebecca from Elite Catering. I'll be taking over your service today. A few mumbled acknowledgments, but most of them didn't even look up. I positioned myself near the catering station, clipboard in hand, trying to look like a supervisor reviewing service standards. The Hong Kong transfers should be completed by the end of the week, Whitmore was saying. Peterson, I want you to personally oversee the documentation. What kind of documentation? Peterson asked. The kind that makes everything look legitimate, Davidson replied. Invoices, contracts, payment authorizations. Make it look like we're paying for actual services. I scribbled notes, my handwriting barely legible in my haste to capture everything. This was even worse than I'd initially thought. They weren't just hiding money. They were actively creating false documentation to cover their tracks. And the Seattle branch? Asked the youngest executive. The Seattle branch is perfect, Whitmore said with satisfaction. Remote location, minimal oversight, and a manager who asks no questions. We've been running money through there for 2 years. 2 years. I calculated quickly. If they'd been moving 8 figures annually for 2 years, we were looking at potential fraud in the hundreds of millions of dollars. More coffee? Rebecca asked, appearing at my elbow with a fresh pot. They're discussing the Seattle branch, I murmured as she moved past me. She nodded slightly and continued serving, her expression innocent and focused on her work. She was a natural at this. At 11 o'clock sharp, Whitmore called for a break. Let's stretch our legs, gentlemen. We'll reconvene in 15 minutes to discuss the quarterly projections. Perfect. I caught Jessica's eye and nodded slightly. She appeared in the doorway moments later. Excuse me, she said to the room in general. I need to borrow the catering supervisor for a moment. There's a question about the lunch arrangements. I followed her out of the conference room, my heart pounding with anticipation. We were about to gather evidence that could bring down an entire corrupt organization. But as we walked toward the elevators, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I glanced back over my shoulder and saw Davidson standing in the conference room doorway, his cold eyes following our every move. He was suspicious, and suspicious people were dangerous. Jessica's hands shook slightly as she unlocked Davidson's office door. The executive floor was eerily quiet, with most of the senior staff attending the board meeting. Our footsteps seemed unnaturally loud on the polished hardwood floors. His computer will be password protected, Jessica whispered as we slipped inside the spacious corner office. That's fine. I'm more interested in physical documents right now. I moved quickly to Davidson's desk, scanning the papers scattered across its surface. Look for anything related to Vancouver, Hong Kong, or the Seattle branch. Davidson's office was exactly what I'd expected. Leather furniture, expensive artwork, and a view of the city that probably cost more than most people's annual salary. But it was the filing cabinet behind his desk that caught my attention. Jessica, do you have a key for this? She tried several keys from her ring before finding one that worked. The cabinet was meticulously organized, with files labeled by date and project. But it was the bottom drawer that made my pulse quicken. Offshore Holdings, I read aloud from one file tab. International Consulting. Another tab read, Secondary Accounting, Vancouver. That's it, Jessica breathed. That's what they were talking about. I pulled out the Vancouver file and opened it. Inside were bank statements, transfer records, and what appeared to be invoices for consulting services that had never been performed. The amounts were staggering. Monthly transfers of $2 to $3 million, all documented as legitimate business expenses. Take pictures, I told Jessica, handing her my phone. Document everything, page by page. While she photographed the documents, I continued searching through the files. The Hong Kong folder contained similar records, but with an added twist. The money was being transferred to accounts controlled by shell companies with names that clearly existed only on paper. "How long have we been gone?" I asked, checking my watch. 8 minutes, Jessica replied, still photographing documents. "We have maybe 5 more minutes before they start wondering where you are." I grabbed another file, this one labeled Seattle Operations. Inside were personnel records, expense reports, and what appeared to be instructions for the branch manager on how to process irregular transactions. "This is incredible," I muttered, reading through a memo that essentially outlined how to launder money through the Seattle branch. They've documented their entire criminal operation. "Why would they keep records of illegal activities?" Jessica asked. "Because they never thought they'd get caught. And because they need to keep track of the money for tax purposes. They're still reporting these transactions to the IRS, just not accurately." My phone buzzed with a text. I glanced at it quickly. It was from my supervisor again. "Margot, need status update. Director is asking questions." I typed back. "Major developments. Request immediate backup. Will explain soon." "We need to go," I told Jessica. "But first, I need copies of these documents." There's a printer in the outer office," she said. "But it'll take too long to copy everything. Just the key pages, the bank statements and transfer records." We moved quickly to the outer office, where Jessica fed documents into the printer while I kept watch. The copying seemed to take forever, and I found myself glancing at my watch every few seconds. "Done," Jessica announced, gathering the copies. We returned to Davidson's office, replaced the files exactly as we'd found them, and locked the filing cabinet. I was tucking the copied documents into my blazer when we heard footsteps in the hallway. "Someone's coming," Jessica whispered. We both froze, listening. The footsteps were getting closer, and I could hear the distinctive click of expensive dress shoes on hardwood. "Back entrance," Jessica hissed, pointing toward a door I hadn't noticed before. We slipped through the door just as someone entered the main office. Through the crack in the door, I could see Davidson moving around his desk, checking papers. "He knows," I whispered. Jessica nodded grimly. We waited in the small anteroom, barely breathing, as Davidson continued his inspection. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, he left the office. "Clear," Jessica whispered. We made our way back to the conference room, where I was relieved to see that the executives were still on their break. Rebecca was arranging fresh pastries on the serving table and chatting pleasantly with 2 of the board members. "Everything okay?" she asked quietly as I approached. "Better than okay," I replied, patting my blazer where the documents were hidden. "We hit the jackpot." "Good, because I think we might have a problem. That Davidson guy has been asking questions about you." My blood ran cold. "What kind of questions?" "He wanted to know how long I'd been working for Elite Catering, whether I'd worked with you before, stuff like that. I told him you were new to our company but had lots of experience in corporate catering." "What did he say to that?" "Nothing, but he looked, I don't know, suspicious?" Before I could respond, the executives began filing back into the conference room. Davidson was among them, and I noticed that his eyes found me immediately. He watched as I positioned myself near the catering station, clipboard in hand. "Gentlemen," Whitmore announced, "let's continue with the quarterly projections." But instead of taking his seat, Davidson remained standing. "Actually, Charles, I'd like to address something first." The room fell silent. I felt every muscle in my body tense. "I've been thinking about our conversation earlier," Davidson continued, his voice deceptively casual. "About the auditor who's supposed to visit us this week." "What about it?" Whitmore asked. Davidson's eyes locked onto mine. "I'm wondering if we should be more careful about who we allow in our confidential meetings." "What are you talking about, Robert?" Whitmore followed Davidson's gaze to where I was standing. "She's just catering staff." "Is she?" Davidson asked. "Because I've been in a lot of corporate meetings over the years, and I've never seen a catering supervisor who takes as many notes as our friend here." The room erupted in confused murmurs. I felt my face flush, but I forced myself to remain calm. This was the moment I'd been dreading, but it was also the moment I'd been preparing for. "I'm documenting service standards," I said evenly. "Elite Catering takes client satisfaction very seriously. I'm sure they do, Davidson replied, pulling out his phone. In fact, I'm so impressed with their attention to detail that I decided to call them directly to express my compliments. My heart stopped. Funny thing, Davidson continued. When I asked to speak to the supervisor they'd sent over, they said they weren't aware of sending a supervisor. They said they'd only sent one person, a young woman named Rebecca. The room was dead silent now. Every eye was on me, and I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down like a physical force. So I'll ask you again, Davidson said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Who exactly are you? I looked around the room at the faces staring back at me. Whitmore looked confused and annoyed. Peterson looked terrified. The younger executives seemed torn between curiosity and concern, and Davidson looked triumphant. I thought about my options. I could try to bluff my way out, claim there had been a misunderstanding. I could make excuses and try to leave. I could even try to deny everything. But I'd been in this business long enough to know when the game was up. And besides, I had what I'd come for. I reached into my blazer and pulled out my credentials, holding them up for everyone to see. My name is Margot Chen, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room. I'm a senior auditor with the State Financial Regulatory Commission, and I'm here to conduct a surprise audit of Sterling Financial Group. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Peterson actually knocked over his coffee cup. Two of the younger executives started talking at once. Whitmore's face turned an alarming shade of red, but it was Davidson's reaction that surprised me the most. Instead of anger or fear, he actually smiled. Well played, he said, almost admiringly. I have to say, I didn't see that coming. What you didn't see coming, I replied, was me listening to you discuss financial fraud for the past 3 hours. Alleged fraud, Davidson corrected smoothly. And good luck proving anything based on a conversation you recorded illegally. I didn't record anything, I said. I took notes, lots of notes, about Vancouver accounts, Hong Kong transfers, Seattle operations, and something you called secondary accounting. The color drained from Davidson's face. Around the table, the other executives were looking at each other with growing panic. You have nothing, Whitmore said, but his voice lacked conviction. I have enough, I replied. Bank records, transfer documentation, invoices for non-existent services. Your filing system is very thorough, Mr. Davidson. Davidson's composure finally cracked. You broke into my office? I was given a tour by a helpful employee, I said, not wanting to implicate Jessica. Very educational. This is harassment, Peterson sputtered. We'll have your job for this. Actually, I said, pulling out my phone, I think you'll be too busy dealing with federal investigators to worry about my job. I speed-dialed my supervisor's direct line. He answered on the first ring. Margot, where the hell are you? I'm in the Sterling Financial Executive Conference Room, I said loudly enough for everyone to hear. I need immediate backup, and I need you to contact the FBI. We're looking at large-scale fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. Jesus Christ, Margot. How did you— I'll explain everything when you get here. Just bring everyone you can and tell them to bring search warrants. I hung up and looked around the room. The executives were staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to fury to resignation. Gentlemen, I said, I'd like to thank you for your cooperation today. You've been very helpful. This is entrapment, Davidson said desperately. You can't use anything you heard here. I'm not a police officer, Mr. Davidson. I'm a financial auditor. And everything I heard here was said voluntarily, in the presence of witnesses. I gestured toward Rebecca, who was standing wide-eyed by the catering table, including an unbiased third party who can corroborate my testimony. She's part of your team, Whitmore accused. She's a journalism student who works part-time for a catering company, I replied. She has no connection to the commission and no reason to lie. They'll never believe her, Davidson said, but there was defeat in his voice. They might not, I agreed. But they'll definitely believe the documents I copied from your filing cabinet. Silence fell over the room like a curtain. These men had built their careers on being smarter than everyone else, on staying one step ahead of the law. But today, they'd been outsmarted by someone they'd dismissed as incompetent before they'd even met her. The employees laughed when I carried the coffee tray, I said, looking directly at Davidson. But I was actually the auditor you were waiting for. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see cars pulling into the parking lot. Official cars with government plates. My backup had arrived. I believe, I said, gathering my notes and straightening my blazer. This meeting is adjourned. As federal agents filled the hallway outside, I couldn't help but smile. It had been an unusual day, but sometimes the most unexpected situations led to the most satisfying results. And I'd learned something important. Never underestimate the power of a good cup of coffee and the willingness to listen carefully to what people say when they think no one important is paying attention. After all, I may have been just the help to them, but I was the help with a badge, subpoena power, and a very good memory for details. The game was over, and justice was about to be served.